Hello, linguini. I hope we're close enough that I can call you that now, a term of endearment among linguists. Welcome to episode 9b. In this episode, we're going to learn about a particular characteristic of vowels, how they were written in medieval manuscripts. We're going to learn a little bit of paleography, that is, ancient writing practice. We're going to learn about minims, and we'll have something to say about meter or rhythm, both as it applies to language and as it applies to poetry. Then after a little bit of technical stuff, we're going to switch gears and go historical and look at a few more documents that trace this arc of change from when French was spoken in England to when Middle English began to reassert itself as the language of literature, of power, of the court, and of course of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I'd like to say something about Middle English vowels. And if you recall from the last episode, I said that we're not going to study Middle English in a lot of technical detail the way we did Old English. The reasons are several. Middle English is a transitional period. The inflections of Old English are being lost at different rates in different times. Middle English is also varied geographically. We recognize 5 different dialects of Middle English. And among those dialects, some are comprehensible to us and some are still nearly incomprehensible. So it's very difficult to generalize about Middle English without vastly oversimplifying something, at least for our level of study. I do want to say something about Middle English vowels, and I know that I'm wading into a territory that I've called, too blasted complicated for the most part, really, to even bother trying to understand, even if you really get into this kind of stuff, and I do, except for one thing I would like to share with you. And that is minims. I'll tell you what they are in a moment, but first we are in the study of paleography. You know, graphy, as in calligraphy, beautiful writing, is the study of writing. Paleo, as in paleology, is old. So the study of old writing, manuscript study in the case of the Middle Ages. So we're studying manuscript production. We're going to talk about minims, and we're going to talk specifically about one letter, the letter O. Well, it just so happened that in medieval manuscripts, that MSS, by the way, is the abbreviation for manuscripts, it became hard, just given the handwriting in the manuscripts, to distinguish certain letters. And this is because of a practice of writing with minims. Now, what is a minim? It's a stroke. If you've ever, been taught handwriting in 2nd grade or done some calligraphy, you've paid attention to the strokes you make to form letters. And a minim it's the word minimal. It's a minimal downward stroke, like the beginning of an H. Just a single downward stroke. Now minims had become very popular just in the particular handwriting of Middle English scribes. Many of the following letters, all the following letters were written with minims. An M was like 3 downward strokes. And they do curl a bit at the top and sort of connect, but it's just stroke, stroke, stroke is an M, stroke, stroke is an N. Here's the problem. Sort of stroke, stroke. You can't really tell if it's connected at the top or the bottom. That could also be a U. U and V are basically the same letter, and a double U is really a double V, which is also sort of the same letter. And of course, an I, which is not necessarily dotted, is also a single downward stroke. So imagine trying to read a manuscript where all of those letters are written with 1, 2, or 3 downward strokes. Well, we need to see this to really understand. Here's the word sin, meaning sin, in an actual medieval manuscript. You notice it has the long S, almost like our SH symbol in IPA. So the long S, and then a Y, which is actually one minim, and then a lovely diagonally crossing downward stroke descender. And then look what we have. Stroke, 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 and then that last thing is an E. So sin with two N's, a double N, is written with 4 minims. Now, think and look what that word can be. If you run across this while you're reading a manuscript, you can think, okay, 4 minims. It could be NN, but it could be also, let's see, U, or it could be IM, or it could be WI. It could be I for that matter, although that's not a word. You've got to kind of run through your brain to figure out what word would that be. Sin. So that created all kinds of reading comprehension problems. And where there's a problem, people usually invent a solution. And the solution was, oh, by the way, this will be on your homework. Write the word minim in medieval manuscript hand using minims. I'll let you enjoy that. So, to clarify things, Middle English scribes adopted a French handwriting practice. The French had already encountered this problem. They had solved it. The problem that they really found at the center of the issue was the letter U. U got really hard to distinguish, which is a minim letter, when it was written next to other minim letters. So if you follow me, what they did is they took the U, which is still a U, and they closed it off at the top. In other words, they wrote it basically as an O. Not because it was an O and said O, it was still a U and said U, but just to make all of those minims comprehensible, because U's now have this kind of different version in handwriting. Still is a U, and it still says something we think of as a U. That could be oo, as in boot. It could be as in book, or it could be kind of a U-ish schwa, Now, I just want to clarify that we are talking about orthography. Orthography is about spelling practice, handwriting practice, really. We're not talking about phonetics. Let me show you a lovely example. This is from a lyric, a song, called Lent in his coma with luva tutun. That translates to Lent. And by the way, Lent here means spring, the period leading up to Easter. The spring, which brings Lent, which brings Easter, is come with, I think we would say, with beauty. The glories of spring, think Wordsworth. To town. Lenten has arrived with loveliness in town. It's from a 14th century manuscript called the Harley Manuscript, has a lot of famous poems in it. Here's a bit of it. So let's just look through. You see Lenten is, notice they've dotted the Y because Y and I aren't really separate letters. The S kind of wraps up on itself, and we have what looks like C-O-M-E. And then we have, the next is the word with, and they write it with a thorn on the end, but check out the W. Isn't that spectacular? If any of you are interested in calligraphy, I would love to know how you think that W was formed. So keep that in mind while we think about minims and U's and O's. And then we see L and an O and some minims and an E, and then T-O and then T-O and some more minims. Let's take stock. So we've got Lenten is coma with luva tutun. How do we get that? Let's look at our minims. There are 2 right there in Lenten, but the E and the T are pretty clear, so we don't have much problem. Actually, 2 more minims for the N at the end. We have 3 minims right there in the middle of the word come. And notice that could be an I-N, an N-I, a W, a U-I, 3 I's. And we've got another, what we know to be the vowel U right next to it, which is sort of written with two minims right before. We'll return to that in a second. And then if you jump over to love, you have the V written as two minims. That could totally be an N, right? Or it could totally be two I's. And again, next to it, you have a written O. And then here's one which really points out the ambiguity. That's T-O-U-N-E. But couldn't it be T-O-N-N-E? Or T-O-U-U-E? T-O-W-I-E? And you've got an O next to it again. And thus, what is a U gets rounded off at the top to look like an O for clarity when it occurs next to all of those downward stroke minims. So let's look at where that happens. The first is in the word C-O-M-E. I've written it C-O-M-E because that's how we say the word, write the word today, C-O-M-E. But that is actually a U with a rounded top because it's a U which occurs next to minims. It's written that way for clarity, but it is processed by the medieval reader as a U. Here we have L-O-V-E, and again, we write that with an O because, I mean, think about it. Generations later, people don't know the rule that I'm teaching you right at this very moment, and they say, well, that looks for all the world like an O. So we spell it L-O-V-E and C-O-M-E, but to the original readers in the 14th century, that was a U closed at the top for clarity next to minims. So if I were to render this in rough IPA, it would be something like Lenten is cumma, cumma, not comma, A-E-I-O-U, but cumma, with not lova, but luva, totuna, T-O-U-N-E. So here's one way that you can sort of distinguish your amateur Chaucerians from your advanced Chaucerians, or your amateur Middle English students from advanced Middle English students. Are they going to say Lenten is comma with lova? Or are they going to recognize the Menem issue and say Lenten is cumma with luva totun? As I mentioned, a misunderstanding of this practice of closing off your U next to Menem letters is the reason why we write L-O-V-E, but we don't say loave. I loave you. It sounds like I turn you into bread. We say, I love you. It's a wedge schwa, but it's in the kind of the U family, of you. And have you wondered why we say come and not come, and dove, not dove, well, it actually can say dove, and son, not son. In other words, why do we make U-ish sounds? Because of these O's. The reason is they used to be U's. So check it out. If you apply a rule that we learned way back at the beginning of this course about our goofy spelling, you'd be mistaken. That rule was if something is spelled a certain way today, that's a little fossil reminder of how it used to be pronounced. So we might say, oh, C-O-M-E. It's spelled with an O because it used to be pronounced coma. Wrong. It used to be pronounced coma, like a U, because of the Middle English Menem rule. We write it that way because we used to have to write it that way for our text to be comprehensible, not because we used to say it that way. And that's the one thing I'm sharing with you about medieval vowels. We can apply this rule, of course, to Chaucer. I'll ask you in the homework to look at the 4 green lines and find 5 examples where there's a written O which should be pronounced probably with a wedge, or maybe the handlebar U of By the way, I've left Londes ungreened right there in the last line because it's actually not. One further complication is you can't always be sure when. I know. I'm nervous even saying this. You can't even like apply this rule 100% of the time. It only applies to some of the O's because other O's, like the one in Londes, is actually just an O, if you follow me, right? So 5 U's defined. A quick story. When I first got to my first teaching gig here in Iowa, it was my first year out of graduate school, and I'd been sort of soaked in literary culture, with graduate students for half a decade, and you start to think that the whole world revolves around your specialty. That's what getting a PhD does. And I'd memorized so much of the Canterbury Tales, and I'd been told again and again, everyone has memorized the beginning of the Canterbury Tales. Wanda April with his shores sota, the drocht of marchat perse to the rota. And a generation or two ago, that was true, that if you went to high school or college, you probably memorized the opening line of the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. So I had a class here, this would be 1999, and I said, have any of you memorized the beginning of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English? Students said no, and I said, well, that's okay, but go ask your parents, go ask people about my age, old folks. And so the next day they come in, and one student after another says, I asked everyone in my family, and no one had memorized it. Someone said, I asked everyone who came into Hardee's that day where they were working, and no one had memorized it. I think I might be a step behind the times, but a generation or 2 or 3 ago, people memorized the first sentence of the beginning of English literature, at least English literature that we can read without a translation. And to read it correctly, you need to know the O as U Menem rule. Switching subjects, we're going to think about rhythm for a minute. Linguists think about sounds at the phoneme level or allophone level, individual level, letters, sounds, but we also think about sound in larger terms, larger units like melody or rhythm or pitch, suprasegmentals they're called. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the rhythm of English. Yes, languages do have predominant rhythms, and 1066 transformed ours. Here's how. First of all, you need to know 2 terms. If you've done some scansion, if you've studied Shakespeare or early Bridge Lit with me, you have done some scansion. Or think back to a high school class when they used strange words like trochee and iamb. Those are 2 terms you'll need. A trochee is a sequence of 2 syllables where the first syllable has the stress and the second syllable is unstressed. So take my last name, Kensack. 2 syllables. It's not Kensack, it's Kensack. My last name is a trochee. Oh, my first name is a trochee, Michael. It's not Michael, it's Michael. So that's a trochee. And if you set up a bunch of trochees in a row, you have a trochaic meter. Now, Old English was predominantly trochaic. Why would that be? Remember the stress rule? The same stress rule that explained why the inflectional endings fell off because they leveled out all that schwaffication. If the first syllable of a word is stressed, you just get a lot of stressed unstresseds. So here's what trochaic rhythm sounds like. This is Macbeth. Shakespeare, by the way, uses trochaic rhythm, which is very uncommon today, for supernatural beings or creepy beings or evil beings. It's one of the beautiful things about Macbeth that the witches speak in trochees, and that's a kind of unnatural, creepy sound. And then as they woo Lady Macbeth and Mr. Macbeth to kill the king and go on this murderous spree, the Macbeth starts speaking more and more in trochees. So trochees have a kind of, evil sound because they're unnatural. Old English, however, was naturally trochaic. Trochaic sounds like this. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Trochaic is also pulled out by Edgar Allan Poe when he writes an Edgar Allan poem. You probably know the Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, I'm exaggerating, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. And on it goes. And there's a spooky kind of feeling if you write modern English in trochees. But Old English was naturally trochaic. Let's take some familiar lines. Wuldur, fader. So, does that mean Old English poetry was naturally witchy? I'll leave that up to you. Many of the Cadman lines, in fact, are trochaic. Heovon, riches, wear, etche, drichten, halli, shippend, firum, boldan. By the pricking of my thumbs, something Old English this way comes. So everyday spoken Old English had a trochaic pulse. Now, follow me here. When all of those endings that we studied, the inflectional endings, dropped off, English had to pull a switch. And instead of encoding sort of pronouns, like a he ending on the end of a verb, or a preposition, like for or to or with, on the end of a noun, we had to put little words, we actually call them particles, in front of that word. So, firum foldan, four men of earth. The for and of, those are particles. So as Old English loses the end of its words, their function is replaced by a separate word before the word. Particles might be articles like a or an or the, or a preposition with, for, to, something like that. And they come before, and this is some syntax theory, the head of the phrase, which is the main word in a phrase, the one that would be stressed, the noun or the verb. And you can see where the stress is and isn't. It's not on a or the or with or for, to. It's on the noun or verb that follows. You see what we're building to? In Middle English, with all those little words now, we are moving toward an iambic language, where there's a less important word and then a more important word. A man, the boat, of him, with care. I am not talking about poetry right now. I'm talking about the natural rhythm of the language. Some nice evidence of that, jumping forward a little bit to the birth of America, the Declaration of Independence. That is not a document written in poetry. That's written in prose. But guess what? It has a natural iambic flow to it because Middle English forward does, which makes it scannable as iambic poetry. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Or Chaucer, an ba the dev rivain and switch the cur. So here's a question for you. Why is, and I don't have a number for this, I'm not in math, I'll just make up a number. Why is 97% of poetry in modern English in iambic meter, iambic pentameter, iambic tetrameter? Why, when we go to write meter for modern English, do we almost always pick an iambic meter? I'll let you think about that for the homework. Now let's switch from thinking about the rhythm of the language itself to actual poetry. And let's just review. Beowulf and Old English and the Seafarer and Cadman use that alliterative formula. In other words, they're paying attention to the beginning of words, where the stress is, yeah, right? Not the ending of words, where the rhyme is. They don't care how many syllables are in a line. It's unrhythmic in that sense, but it's rhythmic in the sense that somewhere in the line there are 4 stresses, 2 in each half line. And what makes it poetry is word initial alliteration. So the Normans bring their words, bring their French. They also bring their meter in 2 senses, both in poetry and in prose. They actually bring the practice of using rhythm, ta-dum, 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 and rhyme, seka and seka. That's how they do poetry. But they also bring that rhythm of language. So Middle English, prose and poetry, and Modern English, prose and poetry, have switched from Trochaic to iambic. Well, that's enough technical material for today, I think you'll agree. Let's switch from paleography and suprasegmental phonology to history. And let's just look at a few more texts that show us Norman French giving way to Middle English. As we said, following 1066, there are a couple hundred years where French is the language of the crown, the court, the church, not the service, but the nobility, the archbishops in England. And let's now look at that changing so that the people of England are no longer speaking a divided set of languages, a Germanic Old English and Italic French, but the two are coming together. And as people stop speaking French, they start speaking English, but it's a new Frenchified English, Middle English. We'll just remember that we've looked at the 13th century. Pay attention to dates. We're just going to do a little bit of history within the 1300s. So before the 1300s, we had Robert of Gloucester saying, "They're high men that speak French, and they're lower men that speak English." It says you should be bilingual, but it's pretty much a shame. Poor England. That's the 1200s. And now we come to the 1300s, with a text by Ranulph, or Ralph, Higden's Polychronicon, which basically just means history. And I want you to notice where we are in time. This is the 1340s, and you should be able to identify that as about the time Chaucer was born. Chaucer lived from approximately 1340 to 1400. It's just so important to have certain dates in your head. 1066, Norman Conquest. 1400, death of Chaucer. 1600, Shakespeare's at the height of his career. World War I, 1914 to 1919. World War II, 1939 to 1945. If you have these as a kind of skeleton in your mind, you can encounter new facts and file them relative to other things you already know about. There's a folder for them already waiting in your mind. So, it is now 200 years, roughly, nearly, since the Norman Conquest, and Ranulph Higdens is describing the state of language in England now. What I'm reading you is a translation from what was written originally in Latin. Higden writes, "Children in school, contrary to the usage and custom of other nations." There's that same idea from the Chronicle of Robert of Gloucester that it's only poor England alone that didn't get to hold on to its own language, or the language of whose land has changed. It's quite a firmly implanted notion that language does not change in our history, in our minds. So, children in schools, still 200 years after 1066, are compelled to drop their own language. Notice the really metaphor of ownership of a language. There's still a sense of almost nationalistic pride in the English language. There's a sense that they speak a foreign tongue. And children are compelled, almost like Anglo-Americans compelled Native Americans to give up their native languages and to write and speak in English or be beaten, or worse. Children are compelled in school to construe their lessons, to write their lessons and other tasks in French, and have done so since the Normans first came to England. Boy, they never forget that. Also, gentlemen's children, this will later apply to Chaucer, are taught to speak French from the time they are rocked in their cradles and can talk and play with a child's toy. And provincial men, that would be people from outside the centers of power and prestige, people from the north or from the Midlands, people who wanted to talk in a way which would get them respect, earn them respect, give them access to power. They want to liken themselves to gentlemen. And how do you do that? To become high men, they try with great effort to speak French so as to be more thought of and more worth. This is about the same time, and it's by Robert Manning, and it gives us a totally different perspective. Still from about the time of Chaucer, here's someone else's view. Robert Manning decides, all the way back then, to write something in English, but notice, and it's the history of England, notice how he almost apologizes for, or at least explains the purpose of, I'm doing a weird thing here, I'm writing in English. Here's why. And this is Middle English. Lordings. That's honorable way of saluting your audience. Lordings, that be new here, that are here now. If ye will, listen and learn. This is in, hey, notice it's French form. It's rhymed English. Listen and learn all the story of England, as Robert Manning written it fand. All the story. Story, by the way, used to mean both story and history. This is before modern ideas of historiography and historical accuracy, where story and history is the same thing. So all the story of England, written one way, as he found it written. So he found it written probably in Latin, possibly in French, probably in Latin. So he found it, and what did he do? And on English, written a different way, as it should. So he's translated it. He showed it to you in English. Why? And for who? Not for the learned, but for the lewd. You know the word lewd. It's men who catcall women or expose themselves in public. That's no. Wrong lewd. Lewd has undergone a great shift in meaning. It just used to mean ignorant. It later went on to mean ignorant of social customs, and so you were lewd in the modern sense that you can be arrested for, public lewdness. So who's he writing for? And why is he writing that way? For the people who are ignorant. I'll give it to you in English, because you don't know nothing. And he explains, for though, that's those, that in this land wone, dwell, that the Latin Frankish, French, con. So they don't know Latin or French. So I'm writing for the ignorant. It's pretty amazing that within 30 years, 40 years, Chaucer will be writing what we think of as the beginning of English literature, still read 600 years later, in this language which for Robert Manning is just for the lewd. A little later he says, as they, that is the other authors he's read, have written and said, have all in me English laid. I've laid it into my English. You hear the patriotism of that my? In simple speech. That is, we're not complicated or fancy like those French and Latin speakers. As I could, as well as I could. And why? That is leichtest in man's mouth. It's the lightest in a person's mouth, English is. In other words, to speak Latin, it's kind of heavy on your tongue and it's hard, and French is tough. English, however, is light. It's easy on the tongue. That's also about the time of Chaucer's birth. Within a generation, however, within Chaucer's lifetime, things are changing. One center of power would be the court, would be Parliament. In 1362, Chaucer's now starting his career in his 20s. For the first time in centuries, Parliament is opened not in French in England, but in English. And there's a rule. It's still written down, the records in Latin. And there's a rule called the statute of pleading. And they say, we're going to switch things up. When you come to plead a case before Parliament, the court, all pleas which shall be pleaded in his, the king's courts whatsoever, before any of his justices whatsoever, shall be pleaded, showed, defended, answered, and debated, and judged in the English tongue. And there it is. Power switches to English. Notice I've given you an image of what I just read on the left. On the right, you have the very same thing in the Middle French of the day. So, plaides défendus, respondus, débattus, et jugés en la langue anglaise. Just in case you didn't get all of that, maybe you're someone who only does French, here it is in French for you, so you'll understand that we're talking English now. By 1385, this is just about exactly the same time Chaucer's writing our Canterbury Tales, we have John of Trevisa. He's actually translating the Polychronicon, but this is a bit of his own. And now, look what's happening. Things are really changing. The iceberg of French is breaking up. This manner, he's talking about teaching French to school children, was much more used before the first plague. That's how they'd tell time, 1348. And is since somewhat changed. And he identifies the people who began the change, teachers. For John Cornwall, a master of grammar, changed the teaching in grammar school, we'd say elementary school, and the construing of Latin into French, that is, translating of Latin into French, he changed it to translating from Latin into English. And Richard Pinkrich learned the same manner of teaching from him and other men from Pinkrich, so that now, in the year of our Lord 1385, even dates it for us, thank you very much, John. That is the second year of the second King Richard after the conquest, 9. In the grammar schools of England, children leave French and construe, translate, write, and learn in English. And they have an advantage on one side and a disadvantage on the other. And just like the Chronicle of Robert of Gloucester, there's advantages and disadvantages. Advantages, they learn the grammar in less time because remember, English is lighter on the tongue. Your own languages always seem to be perceived to be easier than foreign languages, right? It seems just natural. And the disadvantage is that now children of grammar school know no more French than their left heel. And you hear that there's a little bit of grumpiness at change, at a loss of something significant. Children these days, young whippersnappers, they aren't learning French any more than they have in their left foot. And that is harmful for them, economically, if they should pass the sea, go to the continent, and work in strange lands. Strange strandes. And in many other cases. Also, gentlemen, like those who helped raise Chaucer, have now much left off teaching their children French. So Chaucer chooses to write in English at the time when Parliament and schools are just saying, you know, there might just be something to this language that was here before the Norman French, our own language. And thus we arrive back to Chaucer and to the portrait of the Prioress. A prioress, by the way, you hear the word prior, she's the head of a nunnery. So she's a monastic leader. And we'll look more at her later. And we'll look at her portrait. Chaucer has portraits of each of his pilgrims, and then they have them tell their tales. So you know who's talking, and then how they tell their story. And he gives us this wonderful detail about her. She likes to be perceived as upper class. She's in the service of God. She's a nun, but she's the head nun, right? And she still wants to be afforded certain reverence. You can tell because Chaucer says this of her. That's her portrait down there, drawn by the illustrator of the Ellesmere manuscript. So Chaucer says of her, "And French she spake, full fair and fetisly." That's our word fetish, which is actually not far from right here. French had become kind of a fetish to her, but it just means elegantly at the time. And French she spoke, full fair and elegantly. Now was it really? Always second guess everything Chaucer says. He's the master of irony and multiple perspectives. What French did she speak exactly? The French she learned in Paris while studying over there? while doing the grand tour or while on a study abroad. No, she spoke French after the school of Stratford-atte-Bow. That's actually a school, a religious school in East London. So this is not the elegant French, the authentic French of Paris. This is the French you would learn if you were trying to sound like you're from. It's like saying, and French she spoke full, fairly, and elegantly after the school of Orange City, Iowa, in the northwestern cornfields of Iowa. Because that, of course, is where the best French comes from. Why? For French of Paris was to hear un know, because she did not know the authentic French as it was spoken in Paris. And you can still hear the dig at the different levels of language. And you can also tell what Chaucer is trying to tell us about how she wants to be perceived. And that will be useful for us as later on we look at the tale that she tells. That's it for now. Jack out.